Imagine a courtroom so silent that the only sound is the faint click of a rosary bead against a trembling finger. A respected Chicago judge, after 28 years on the bench, looks down with icy contempt as a terrified woman dares to whisper a Hail Mary during her trial. He mocks her faith in front of everyone, demanding she put away that thing because this is a court of law, not a chapel. Less than 12 hours later, something happens to that same judge, something impossible, something that smells of heaven itself, that will shake the very foundations of everything he thought he knew about justice, truth, and the power of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Before we continue, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let's see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary have reached. And if you haven't yet joined our family, subscribe now, because here, each day, we witness the tender love and mighty power of the Mother of God. In the heart of Chicago stood the Cook County Courthouse, a place where lives were weighed on the scales of evidence and precedent. For 28 years, one man had presided over those scales with unflinching precision, Judge Harrison Webb. At 56, his gray hair was always perfectly combed, his black robe immaculate, his gaze capable of silencing even the most seasoned attorney with a single glance. People said that when Harrison Webb entered a room, conversation didn't just pause, it froze, as if everyone suddenly remembered every secret they had ever kept. Lawyers respected him, clerks feared him, and defendants learned quickly that sentiment had no place in his courtroom. Justice, in Judge Webb's world, was built on facts alone, cold, hard, irrefutable facts. That Tuesday morning began like any other. The docket was full, the air thick with tension. By the third case, a defense attorney was pleading for bail, grasping at the usual arguments: community ties, family responsibilities, promises of good behavior. Harrison never even looked up from his papers. "Your client has 3 prior convictions," he said, his voice calm but cutting like a scalpel. The attorney faltered, searched his notes, found nothing. Bail denied. Next case. It was over in less than 30 seconds. That was Harrison Webb, efficient, merciless, and utterly convinced that the law left no room for anything beyond what could be proven. By 6:15 that evening the courthouse had emptied, its long marble corridors echoing only with the judge's measured footsteps. 20 minutes later, he was home in his high-rise apartment, nodding curtly to the doorman whose name he had never learned in 3 years. Everything inside was exactly as he had left it, spotless, silent, and lonely. He dropped his briefcase on the couch, heated a frozen dinner without bothering to check the label, and scrolled through work emails while the microwave hummed. This was his life, orderly, predictable, and completely solitary. Years earlier, there had been warmth in Harrison's world. His wife, Margaret, an architect with a radiant laugh, had filled their home with the smell of Sunday roasts and the sound of easy conversation. But gradually the dinners grew quiet, the conversations shorter, until one Saturday morning she looked at him across the kitchen table and said, "I can't do this anymore, Harry. I'm living alone inside a marriage." 3 weeks later, the divorce papers arrived. He signed them without protest, moved into the sterile apartment, and buried himself deeper in the only thing that still made sense: the law. Across the city, in a cramped pull-out bed at her sister's apartment, 34-year-old Emma Lawson was living a nightmare. For 10 years, she had been the beloved principal of a local school, remembering every teacher's birthday, staying late to help parents, knowing the janitor's dog by name. Now her savings were frozen, her reputation shattered, and she faced accusations of tampering with financial documents that could send her to prison for years. The evidence looked overwhelming: forged signatures, transactions traced to her computer, witnesses who swore they had seen irregularities. Her public defender, young and exhausted, could only repeat the prosecutor's offer: plead guilty, serve 18 months. But Emma refused. "I didn't do it," she kept saying, her voice breaking. "I could never betray those children." Thursday arrived, the day the jury would deliver its verdict. Emma sat in the defendant's chair, knuckles white, stomach churning so badly she hadn't eaten in 24 hours. In her blazer pocket rested her grandmother's rosary, blue glass beads worn smooth by decades of prayer. As the minutes dragged on and the jury remained out, Emma's desperation grew. Almost without thinking, she slipped the rosary into her cupped hands and began whispering the familiar words. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." The gavel slammed down like thunder. "Ms. Lawson," Judge Webb's voice sliced through the room. Every head turned. His eyes, cold and unyielding, fixed on her. "This is a court of law, not a chapel. Put that away." A nervous laugh escaped someone in the gallery. Another person coughed to hide their discomfort. Emma's face burned crimson. Tears welled up as she fumbled the rosary back into her pocket, whispering a trembling apology. The judge struck the gavel again. "We return tomorrow at 2 p.m. Dismissed." Emma could barely stand. Her sister Rachel rushed to support her as they left the courtroom, tears streaming freely now. At the door, they passed a quiet man in a gray suit, Brian Mitchell, who had attended every single day of the trial, watching in silence. That night, Harrison reviewed the Lawson file one last time. The evidence was airtight. The case seemed open and shut. He placed the folder on his nightstand, went through his routine, teeth brushed, pajamas on, and slipped into bed convinced that tomorrow would bring the expected guilty verdict. As sleep finally claimed him, the apartment remained as silent and flowerless as ever. At exactly 3 a.m., Harrison Webb's eyes snapped open as if someone had shouted his name. His heart pounded against his ribs for no reason he could name. Then it reached him, the fragrance. Not a faint trace, not a memory, but an overwhelming, living perfume of fresh roses, so intense it felt as though he had been dropped into the middle of a blooming garden in June. He sat bolt upright, switched on every light, and walked through the apartment like a man searching for an intruder. Windows sealed, air conditioning off, no vases, no candles, no trace of flowers anywhere, yet the scent flooded every room, sweet and impossible, almost warm against his skin. Harrison Webb had spent 28 years dismantling illusions. He had cross-examined expert witnesses who claimed to smell gas leaks that weren't there, listened to defendants swear they had seen ghosts, watched grown men weep over signs from heaven. He had always found the rational explanation, and when he couldn't, he simply refused to believe. But this was different. This was inside his locked, sterile apartment at 3 in the morning, and the fragrance clung to him like a presence. He stood barefoot in the living room, arms outstretched, turning in slow circles as if the air itself might confess. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the scent vanished, leaving only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the echo of his own ragged breathing. He did not sleep again that night. He sat at the kitchen table with black coffee burning his tongue, staring at the white wall while fragments of forgotten childhood prayers surfaced like debris after a flood. His mother had been devout. Every evening she knelt beside his bed and taught him to say, "Hail Mary," before the darkness came. When he was 12, she died of cancer, and Harrison decided that if God allowed such things, he either didn't exist or didn't care. From that day forward, he had trusted only what could be measured, signed, and filed in triplicate. Yet now the scent of roses, the signature perfume of the Virgin Mary in countless approved apparitions from Guadalupe to Lourdes, had invaded the fortress of his unbelief. Morning light crept across the city. Harrison showered longer than usual, letting the scalding water try to wash away the memory. He was knotting his tie when the phone rang. "Judge Webb, it's Prosecutor Henderson." The man sounded shaken. "Something has happened in the Lawson case. Something urgent." Harrison's fingers froze on the silk knot. "The sentencing is at 2. What could possibly be urgent?" A pause. "Catherine Ross just woke up." Catherine Ross. The name hit like a gavel. Administrative secretary at Emma Lawson's school. Key witness who could have cleared the defendant 6 months ago, but who had lain in a coma ever since a single-car accident the night she claimed she saw the real thief at work. Doctors had given her almost no chance. "She woke up this morning," Henderson continued, voice trembling with disbelief, fully lucid. "The first thing she asked was about Emma's trial. She says she can prove Emma is innocent and that she must testify today, before the verdict." Harrison felt the floor tilt beneath him. Catherine Ross regains consciousness in the early hours of the very morning he is suffocating in the scent of heavenly roses. Coincidence? His rational mind screamed yes. Every other part of him was no longer certain that he arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. Clerks noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he signed the docket. Reporters were already gathering. News of the comatose witness waking had spread like wildfire through Chicago's Catholic community. At 9:27 a.m., Henderson called again. The doctors confirm she's oriented, speaking clearly, remembers everything. She's desperate to testify, Your Honor. She keeps saying the Virgin Mary woke her up because an innocent woman is about to be condemned. Harrison closed his eyes. The scent came back to him so vividly, he almost swayed. Set up the video link, he ordered, surprised at the steadiness of his own voice. We hear her at 2 o'clock, before the jury returns. He spent the remaining hours in his chambers with the door locked, staring at the Lawson file he now knew by heart. Every piece of evidence that had once seemed ironclad now carried a faint question mark. Access logs, forged signatures, missing funds. Everything pointed to Emma, yet something had always nagged at him, a splinter he couldn't pull free. He thought of the blue rosary he had humiliated in open court, of Emma's tear-stained face, of the way her whispered Hail Mary had sounded less like desperation and more like certain. At 1:58 p.m. the courtroom was fuller than anyone could remember. Word had raced through parishes, prayer groups, and WhatsApp chains. A woman in a coma for 6 months had awakened to save another woman who prayed the rosary. Emma entered supported by her sister, pale as candle wax, the blue beads visibly wrapped around her fingers this time. Harrison looked at her for a long moment and felt something tighten in his chest. He did not tell her to put them away. He brought the room to order with a single strike of the gavel that sounded different today, less like a weapon and more like a heartbeat. Before the jury presents its verdict, he announced, voice carrying to the back row, this court will hear emergency testimony from Catherine Ross. The massive screen flickered to life, and there she was, a fragile woman propped against hospital pillows, Verline still in her arm, but eyes bright and fierce with purpose. The entire room seemed to lean forward as one body, breathing the same held breath. The screen glowed with Catherine Ross's face, and in that moment the courtroom felt less like a hall of judgment and more like a sacred space where heaven itself had chosen to speak. Pale from months in a hospital bed, Catherine's eyes shone with a clarity that silenced every doubt. Tubes still traced delicate lines across her arm, yet her voice rang out steady and strong, carrying the weight of truth long buried. Your Honor, she began, I have worked alongside Emma Lawson for 8 years. She is the most honest person I know. She would never touch those documents, never betray the trust of the children or the staff. A ripple of whispers swept the room, but Harrison's gavel fell once, sharp and commanding, restoring a hush so complete that even the rustle of papers seemed irreverent. Explain everything, Ms. Ross, he said, his tone gentler than anyone had ever heard it. Catherine drew a breath that seemed to draw strength from somewhere beyond the sterile hospital walls. It was Brian Mitchell, the financial coordinator. I saw him multiple times after hours, sitting at Emma's computer, altering records, forging her signature. He thought the building was empty, but I often returned for forgotten files. One night, he caught me watching through the glass. He followed me to the parking lot, cornered me against my car, and threatened my family if I ever spoke. I was terrified. 2 weeks later, my brakes failed. I crashed into a pole. Doctors said I might never wake up. Tears traced silent paths down Catherine's cheeks, yet her gaze never wavered from the camera. This morning, when my friend told me Emma was about to be convicted, something pulled me back. I opened my eyes and knew I had to speak. The Virgin Mary didn't let me sleep forever while an innocent woman suffered. Emma didn't do anything. Nothing. Emma sat frozen in the defendant's chair, the blue rosary wound so tightly around her fingers that the beads left tiny indentations in her skin. Tears fell unchecked onto her lap as she listened to the truth she had carried alone for so long finally pour into the open. Across the aisle, Brian Mitchell's face drained of color. He stared at the floor as though the marble might swallow him whole. The prosecutor rose, face flushed, voice thick with the shock of a case unraveling before his eyes. Your Honor, in light of this testimony, I request immediate suspension of all charges against Emma Lawson while we launch a full investigation into Brian Mitchell. This will require time. Harrison looked slowly around the packed gallery, reporters scribbling furiously, parishioners from Emma's school clutching their own rosaries, a priest in the back row with hands folded in silent thanksgiving. Then his eyes returned to Emma. whose lips moved almost imperceptibly in the words, "Hail Mary, full of grace." This time he did not stop her. Something ancient and tender stirred in his chest, like the first crack in a glacier that has held winter for decades. He remembered the scent of roses that had filled his apartment only hours ago, the same heavenly fragrance that has announced Our Lady's presence to saints and children for centuries, from the roses of Guadalupe that bloomed in winter to the petals that fell in Lipa and Quito. Was this what had awakened Catherine? Was this what had awakened him? "Charges are temporarily suspended," Harrison declared, his voice carrying a new gravity. "The defendant will remain free on her own recognizance. We reconvene in 1 month." The gavel fell softer than usual, almost like a benediction. Emma opened her eyes, wide with disbelief. It was not full vindication yet, but it was breath after months of suffocation, the first ray of dawn after the longest night. Rachel enveloped her in a fierce embrace as they left the courtroom, the blue rosary now held openly, no longer hidden in shame. That evening the story spread like holy fire through Chicago's Catholic neighborhoods. Prayer groups gathered spontaneously, candles flickered before statues of the Blessed Mother. Messages flooded parish WhatsApp groups. She woke from the coma. The rosary saved her. Our Lady interceded. In hospitals and homes, people who had never met Emma began praying decades for her complete freedom, trusting that the same mother who crushed the serpent would not abandon her child now. Back in his apartment, Harrison poured a drink he didn't taste and stared out over the city lights. The scent of roses did not return, yet its memory lingered like incense after Massachusetts. For the first time in years, he did not open a case file. Instead, he sat in silence, replaying Catherine's words, Emma's tears, the way the courtroom had felt charged with something greater than law. He thought of his own mother, who had died clutching her rosary, whispering, "Holy Mary, pray for us," even as the cancer consumed her. He had rejected her faith the day she was buried. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered if she had been right all along. Emma spent the evening on her knees beside the sofa bed, the blue beads slipping through her fingers one by one as she offered 50 mysteries of thanksgiving. "Thank you, dear mother," she whispered again and again, "for waking Catherine, for touching the judge's heart, for not abandoning me." Outside, the Chicago wind howled, but inside her sister's tiny apartment peace settled like a warm mantle. Hope, fragile yet luminous, had been reborn. 1 month. 30 nights of waiting, 30 dawns that felt borrowed. For Emma Lawson, those 30 days were a slow crucifixion of hope. She woke every morning on the narrow sofa bed, stomach knotted, mouth dry, the blue rosary already warm from being clutched all night. Some days she managed to eat half a slice of toast. Most days she simply knelt on the living room rug and began again where she had left off at 3 a.m. Hail Mary, full of grace. The beads had become her lifeline, her battle weapon, her only certainty in a world that had turned upside down. Her sister Rachel tried everything, jokes, movies, long walks along Lake Michigan. But even Rachel's optimism grew thin. "They're investigating, Em. That's good, right?" Emma would nod, but her eyes always drifted back to the little statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe that now sat on the windowsill, its painted mantle the only color in the gray apartment. Across the city, in the silence of his high-rise, Harrison Webb was also counting the days. He conducted hearings with the same precision as always, gavel sharp, rulings swift, yet clerks noticed he no longer hurried the defendants who bowed their heads in silent prayer. Twice he caught himself staring at the exact spot on the bench where Emma's trembling hands had held the rosary, and each time the memory of roses, real, impossible roses, washed over him again. He waited every night for the fragrance to return, half dreading it, half longing for it. It never did. Instead, sleeplessness became his new companion. He would sit in the dark living room, glass of bourbon untouched, asking questions he had spent a lifetime refusing to ask. What if the world is larger than evidence? What if justice sometimes arrives wearing a mantle of blue and speaking with the voice of a woman in a coma? Chicago itself seemed to hold its breath. Parishes added Emma's name to the prayer of the faithful. A group of grandmothers from St. Philomena's met every dawn in the church basement to pray the entire 15 decades for her. School children who once feared, The mean principal who was on TV now drew pictures of her holding a glowing rosary and taped them to the school gate. Someone started a WhatsApp chain titled Blue Rosary Novena, and within days it had thousands of members, each promising 1 decade a day until justice came. Then came the morning that changed everything. Thursday, 1 month to the day. The courthouse was packed again, standing room only. News vans lined the street. Reporters who had once camped to film a conviction now waited to film a miracle. Emma walked in wearing the same blue blazer, now hanging looser on her frame. The rosary was wrapped twice around her wrist like a bracelet of living hope. She took her seat, closed her eyes, and began moving her lips in silent prayer. Harrison entered, and the room fell into the kind of hush usually reserved for cathedrals. He looked older, somehow, the lines around his eyes deeper, the set of his shoulders less rigid. He struck the gavel once, softly. Prosecutor Henderson rose, holding a thick folder that had not existed 30 days earlier. He cleared his throat twice before he could speak. "Your Honor, the investigation is complete." He paused, looked directly at Emma for the first time in the entire trial, and when he spoke again his voice cracked with something close to awe. "Last night, acting on information provided by Catherine Ross, detectives executed a search warrant at the residence of Brian Mitchell. They recovered 3 encrypted flash drives hidden inside a hollowed-out book of poetry, ironic, given the lies he told. Those drives contained the original unaltered documents, timestamps proving he worked alone after hours, emails where he bragged about framing the perfect scapegoat, and a full confession recorded on his own phone the moment detectives knocked. When confronted, Mitchell broke down immediately. He admitted forging every signature, using Emma's login while she was at parent-teacher conferences, routing the money through shell accounts he thought could never be traced. He did it, he said, because the school board was about to audit his department and he needed someone to take the fall. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like wind across wheat. A woman in the back row began the Hail Mary out loud. Within seconds, half the gallery had joined her. Henderson waited for silence, then continued, voice now steady and solemn. Brian Mitchell was arrested at 11:47 p.m. He has been charged with felony fraud, aggravated identity theft, and attempted murder in the tampering of Catherine Ross's brakes, a charge made possible by forensic evidence recovered from his garage. Your Honor, on behalf of the people of the state of Illinois, I move for immediate and total dismissal of all charges against Emma Marie Lawson with prejudice. Furthermore, I ask this court to enter a formal apology on the record for the suffering inflicted upon an innocent woman. Harrison did not move for a long moment. He looked at Emma, really looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time. Her eyes were closed, tears streaming down both cheeks, lips still forming the words of the Glory Be. The rosary beads trembled violently in her lap. "Emma Lawson," he said, and his voice carried a timbre no one in that room had ever heard from him before, something gentle, almost broken. "Please rise." She tried. Her knees buckled instantly. David, the young public defender, caught her just before she hit the floor. The blue rosary slipped from her fingers, and the thread, worn thin from months of desperate prayer, snapped. Beads scattered in every direction, bouncing across the marble like tiny drops of sapphire rain. The sound they made was impossibly loud in the stunned silence, a delicate, heartbreaking melody. And then something happened that would be spoken of in Chicago Catholic circles for decades. Judge Harrison Webb, the man who for 28 years had never once descended from the bench during a session, set down his gavel and stepped down the 3 small stairs as though they were the distance between earth and heaven. The black robe that had always made him look untouchable now seemed suddenly too heavy, as if the fabric itself understood what was happening. Every eye in the courtroom followed him. Reporters forgot to type. Bailiffs forgot to breathe. The priest in the back row let the rosary slip from his fingers and did not even notice. Harrison knelt on the cold marble floor, right there in front of the defendant's table, in front of the prosecutors, in front of the city that had feared him for nearly 3 decades. With hands that had signed death warrants and life sentences, he began gathering the scattered blue beads one by one. The worn glass caught the overhead lights and threw tiny fragments of sapphire across the walls like a private aurora. He did not rush. He searched under chairs, reached beneath the rail, collected every single bead until the broken string lay complete again in his open palm. Then he stood, walked the few steps to where Emma was still half collapsed against her attorney, and gently, reverently, placed the restored rosary into her trembling hands. Their eyes met. For the first time in his life, Harrison Webb had no words, no ruling, no citation. Emma tried to speak, managed only a whisper meant for him alone. "Thank you." A tear fell from the judge's eye, one single tear that carried 28 years of certainty. And he did not wipe it away. That he returned to the bench, took up the gavel, and when he spoke his voice was quiet but carried to the last row. "All charges against Emma Marie Lawson are dismissed with prejudice. This court extends its profound apology to Miss Lawson for the suffering she has endured. Case closed." The gavel fell like a bell announcing Easter morning. The gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in something closer to Pentecost. People wept openly, strangers embraced. A woman began singing the Salve Regina, and within seconds the entire room had joined her. Emma was lifted to her feet by dozens of hands, teachers, parents, former students who had slipped into the courtroom, until she stood in the middle of a living embrace. The blue rosary pressed against her heart. 6 months later, the school courtyard was filled with balloons the exact color of those beads. Students and teachers lined the walkway and applauded for 5 straight minutes when Emma walked through the gate for the first day of the new semester. Catherine Ross, walking without a cane, laughing without pain, stood at the front, arms wide open. Doctors still called her recovery medically inexplicable. She simply smiled and said, "I had an appointment I was not allowed to miss." And Harrison Webb? He still presides in the same courtroom, robes still immaculate, rulings still swift. Defendants still tremble when he enters. But something has changed forever. On quiet afternoons, when a frightened man or woman clutches a rosary and begins to pray under their breath, Harrison no longer reaches for the gavel. He waits. He lets them finish. Sometimes, those who sit close to the bench swear they have seen the faintest trace of a smile touch the corner of his mouth. And once, only once, a court reporter claims she caught the faintest scent of roses drifting through the air conditioning vents on an ordinary Tuesday in October. Oh, you believe in coincidences? Harrison Webb spent most of his life answering yes. Then one blue rosary, one midnight fragrance, one woman pulled from the edge of death, and one judge on his knees on a courtroom floor taught him that some things cannot be entered into evidence. Yet they remain eternally true. The scent of roses never returned to his apartment. It didn't need to. Some miracles come only once, just long enough to break open a heart of stone and let the light of heaven pour in forever. If this story moved you, do 3 small things for Our Lady today. 1. Write in the comments. Blue rosary, the object he once humiliated and later returned with respect. 2. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that the Mother of God still walks into courtrooms. 3. Pray one Hail Mary right now for every soul who has ever been wrongly accused. May the same Virgin who turned a judge's heart keep watch over you and your family, today and always. Amen.